Are you a woman in the corporate world striving to break barriers, challenge unconscious bias, and lead the way for women in leadership roles globally? If so, this is the podcast for you. Introducing Leading Ladies Who Lunch. The lunch hour is usually the time when colleagues get together for real, honest conversations about work, life, and everything in between. In each episode of Leading Ladies Who Lunch, we'll delve into insightful discussions and share actionable strategies to help you navigate corporate life. Co-hosted by me, Cece George, a leadership development architect and inspirational speaker. I'm thrilled to share my experience and expertise on leadership, mentorship, and organizational intelligence to help you own your career.
And me, Rachel Lowndes, CEO and founder, imposter syndrome expert, and mindset coach at Rachel Lowndes Coaching and Consulting. Passionate about helping women conquer imposter syndrome and unleash their inner confidence to get the recognition and promotions they deserve.
Jam-packed with insightful conversations, expert advice, and inspiring stories from a diverse group, we'll explore how to overcome obstacles, shatter those glass ceilings, and build unshakable mindsets to unlock your true potential. So whether you're sipping a coffee or enjoying a meal at your desk, tune in for a no-host bar lunchtime chat. Episodes will be dropped every 2 weeks. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Leading Ladies Who Lunch, empowering women, one conversation at a time.
Hello, and welcome back to the Leading Ladies Who Lunch podcast. Rachel, you're so beautiful today. What's going on?
Oh, thanks, Cece. What a lovely start to the day for me. I'm very well, thank you. I'm loving how your jumper is matching our Zoomy background today.
I feel so on point.
It's so on brand.
Right?
How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. The weather here is just awesome. I feel like when the weather is warm outside, it's an instant mood lifter. I don't know if you feel that way, but when it's
Yes.
rainy and gray, I just feel like, staying under the blanket.
It's kind of opposite here in Australia because it's kind of sunny a lot here. And so
Oh,
when we get rainy days, we're like, yay, it means I can stay home and do nothing.
got
But
it.
yeah, I mean, sunny days are always a mood lifter. That is true.
They are. They are. All right. So this is part 2 of our special public speaking presentation and communication masterclass. If you
Yes.
haven't checked out the first part, we'll include a link for it in the show notes. So please take a listen to that. But in this episode, we're going to dive into executive presence and how to show up authentically in those high stakes presentation moments. And we're going to explore what executive presence is all about. And of course, share tips on how you can be your true self when the pressure is on.
Oh, such a good topic. I think we're all going to get something out of this, whether you're in the C-suite already, middle management, or just starting out. This episode is going to be really useful for everyone.
Oh, I agree. So let's dive right in. What is executive presence anyway? All right, I'm going to skip the corporate formal definition and go with what I've observed. For me and what I've observed, it's all about how you carry yourself. Having executive presence means people see you as confident, credible, and capable. And it's absolutely key for leadership roles and making a strong impression.
Yeah, presence is a vibe. It's all about the energy you bring. So understanding how to elevate your presence and energy is going to have a really big impact on your career.
Oh, for sure, which also connects to your professional brand. So it's really all interconnected, right?
Yeah, we have to look at ourselves holistically, not as isolated parts that we bring to the forefront when we think it matters. We have to really have that presence in mind all the time wherever we appear. So whether that's at home, whether that's online, whether that's at work, whether that's
Mhm.
in a social setting, it all kind of it's the sum of the parts, right?
Right. It's all cohesive. I totally agree. And that is something that I started really understanding more in the last few years, actually. I remember I first started hearing about executive presence probably a little bit more than a decade ago. And when I first heard the concept, I immediately started to think about all the different executives and leaders that I've worked with or met. And I started to analyze what about them stood out to me. And, some leaders just had that confidence and charisma, which is what immediately drew me to them. So I'm thinking about what drew me to that person. Others were inspiring with their vision, and they were able to tell a really good story along with that. But they also managed to do that with expertise and know how, all while being authentic and relatable from what I've observed. And those are the key attributes that really stood out to me. What about you? Or who comes to mind when you think of executive presence?
Well, to be honest, I've never heard this terminology before I met you. So
Oh,
you actually taught me this. Only
oh,
because I just hadn't heard, that phrasing, but obviously having
I
presence is
see.
an interesting thing. So I mean, I actually didn't think about it as something I'd seen in others or even needed in myself, but it does make total sense, right? It really is about the impression you leave on people and how you present yourself, what you
Mhm.
bring. And this applies in any situation, as I said before, whether you're at work or not. So I've started to be a bit more conscious about it for myself and reflected on how I've presented myself in my past career, how leaders in my former companies presented and the impact that they had on me. It's really
Right.
super fascinating to think about that. I've learned a lot about myself just from doing that reflection. And
So important.
I mean, I realized I definitely failed in having executive presence, and that
Mm,
showed up in that lack of progress in my career. I simply lacked confidence and I doubted myself too much to put myself forward for senior or leadership positions, despite being encouraged to go for them. I was just too
right.
scared to. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that I actively, if subconsciously, sabotage myself in many ways.
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, if I got too close to being seen or noticed, I would unintentionally do something that would let me down and immediately make people rethink me as an option, right?
Oh, wow.
How ridiculous is that? But it's not something I actively, I didn't intentionally go out to like sabotage myself, but there would be a behavior that would then lead to that sabotaging because the underlying belief was I wasn't good enough or smart enough to be in those positions. I was too scared. The fear was leading me, and therefore the fear dominated the behavior, which resulted in the outcome. So
Right.
I can see how all of that played out now, having done so much personal development work and mindset work. A fascinating thing to reflect on and understand about yourself.
Wow, that's amazing because it just highlights to me how important it is for you to do that work of getting to know yourself and
Mm,
knowing how that self-talk, what that self-talk looks like and how that can be,
mm,
whether it's consciously or unconsciously sabotaging your potential. I mean, you really just articulated that so clearly here and I think a lot of professionals, we're so used to just working. We don't actually spend time reflecting on how we're growing in that work, in that journey, because it is a journey, right?
mm.
I actually didn't know that about you. I love that we learn new things about each other. But yeah, I want to highlight what you said about lacking confidence and doubting yourself. And that definitely plays a role,
Mm,
in how you show up with
mm.
or without executive presence. And
Yeah.
I think what's tricky when it comes to executive presence or EP is that sometimes there is an image that people associate with executive presence or EP. Someone like me who is diverse might not immediately fit a vision for what executive presence is, unless, of course, if you hear me speak, you might think differently. But, with EP, it's challenging for some people because part of it means speaking up and if you grew up in a household where by culture you were taught not to speak up because that is seen as going against authority, it's being too vocal, too opinionated, which doesn't look uh, ideal. So things like that, EP didn't come naturally for me. And again, because I only was familiarized with this concept a little bit more than a decade ago, man, it was it was something I had to work on and something that I still work on.
Yeah. I mean, I can relate to that, not from a diverse background, but I was silenced as a child. So my feelings or opinions didn't matter. I was often told that I didn't know what I was doing or what I was talking about. So,
Mhm.
as you can imagine, those messages have a direct effect on my ability to speak up and share my ideas and feel confident about what I'm capable of, and et cetera, the imposter syndrome route, which we've
Right,
discussed in many different ways. So, it wasn't safe for me to be confident about being present because my presence in that situation at home was more of an annoyance than anything else. And
mhm.
that's how it felt anyway. I'm not saying that that's what my parents meant, but that's how
Right.
it felt.
No,
I think we have to
right.
understand that there's intention and there's also feelings,
Impact.
yeah, what you're taking from
Yeah,
it, right? So
right.
there's obviously a lot to unpack there. So, but
Yes.
it stands to reason that if you are silenced or you feel silenced as a child and you feel like you're annoying and that your position in the house is annoying, then you adapt your behavior to fit in because not fitting in
Right,
attacks our basic needs for love and security. And as children, that's what we know we need to
right,
get. So being present wasn't safe. Therefore, this translated into my career where being seen wasn't safe. Right. I'm only just learning this stuff now, which is why I'm sharing it with everybody
right.
here. So I
Of course.
minimized myself, right? That's the consequences of those feelings, thoughts, and the behavior was minimizing myself. So, I mean, that just hit really hard. And this is stuff I'm actually doing right now. I'm doing a shadow work certification, which people probably might not understand, but it's understanding the bits of us that keep us fearful and safe, right? So I'm
Absolutely.
wondering what I've just talked about there, wondering if some of our listeners might experience and be able to relate to some of that too.
Oh, absolutely. I'm even just thinking about how what you're saying is affecting me and how
Mm,
I felt growing up. I mean, yeah, we both can relate to how we've had similar messaging in terms of not being encouraged to speak up because maybe our opinions or thoughts weren't seen as, substantial enough for whatever reason. But
mm,
that also, again, for me, translated to my career, to me feeling like I just always had to work that much harder because I was never going to be good enough because what I said. In my house, it was always, my brother is a Harvard educated physician, which is a huge thing in my family. And whatever he has said is seen as pretty much the word of God. See, because he is a Harvard educated physician, so his words carry a lot of weight. I am
yeah,
none of those things. I have a regular bachelor's degree and I also have a master's degree, yet
right.
somehow I still feel like I don't measure up. So I'm
That's
constantly
so
feeling
interesting.
like nothing I do is
Yeah,
good enough. And I
that's
often heard
interesting.
that come across in terms of how my parents talked about us.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if my father, talks about his kids, he's usually just talking about my brother and what
Mm.
he's accomplished. I've till this day not heard my father talk about what I've accomplished or even acknowledging that I've gotten my master's degree.
Right, and it's so interesting what you said there because you're talking about a lot of cultural nuance as well, aren't you? Because of you're from a Southeast Asian background, and of course, men are, or boys, sons are
Yes.
revered. And yet you have a bachelor's and a master's. Like, I've only got a master's. You know what I mean? It's like
Right, only.
minimizing our own accreditations.
Right. And that actually is interesting because it also is, I even remember when I got my master's, it was not something I mean, I think I put a post on Facebook, but I didn't really share a lot of it with my coworkers because it almost felt like, oh, well, you just got your master's. It almost felt like it was an expectation for me to be at the playing field, not
Right.
even in the game.
Yeah, got it.
So
Interesting.
if I maybe go on to get my doctorate degree, I might actually get to play the game.
Yeah.
It's what I was thinking. It's so crazy, but yeah, and I imagine, Rachel, that many of our listeners right now are thinking about perhaps how they were raised, not
Mhm.
fully utilizing their voice. And this is bringing to their surface so many different things that they've had to experience and how that affected their trajectory. Because all of this influences, as you say,
Mm.
what you pursue. If you are taught not to share your opinions or vocalize your opinions or challenge authority or question things, you might not go after leadership roles because in that role you have to do all those things. So
Yeah.
it's really bringing up a lot of things. I think we're both agreeing here.
Yeah, the reflection on it kind of sees how things play out, so it's good to do that and understand
Yeah,
why you
for
feel.
sure.
Mm.
Well, we've shared our thoughts about executive presence. Let's break down some strategies for how our listeners can develop executive presence for themselves. And the first point that I'm going to add here is you have to portray yourself as an executive because going back to what we just this conversation that we're just literally landing off of, part of how this comes up is how you portray yourself and present yourself. So for me, because I was not taught to vocalize what I'm thinking or seeing or question things, I tended to more blend in with the background. So make sure you stand tall, make eye contact, dress with confidence, just keep your calm and cool, especially when things are challenging. You know, for example, during a presentation, I would avoid slouching and use open hand gestures to emphasize points and choose an outfit that aligns with the culture of your audience. Because all of those things will lend itself to making not only you feel confident, but portraying and coming across as powerful. You do have to look and play the part, but to do that authentically while remaining true to who you are as a person, which means don't just copy what other people do. If it doesn't feel good for you, don't do that.
Yeah, for me, there's always a mindset behind why we may not demonstrate behaviors that show our presence or portray our intelligence. Uh, obviously, I talked about that a little bit from my own experience before. So, if any of our listeners find themselves struggling with this, then I would suggest finding a mindset coach to help you unlock anything that's potentially holding you back. And I
Right.
do. I do work with my clients on this. So if you do feel called to connect with me on that topic, there's a link to book a time with me to chat in the show notes. But I'm also what I'm really referring to here is that inner chat that might just come into our head, when when you had just heard portray yourself as an executive, right? It's easy enough to say that, but it's not always easy enough to execute. So if you do have negative self-talk that's preventing you from taking action, then I would seek to find a way to work through that, understand it, become aware of it, then look for ways to move through it. Can't always do this on your own. So that's why I
Right.
do suggest working with a coach.
Right. And thank you for pointing that out. I agree here that mindset is key for sure. The second point that I'll throw in here is to be clear in your communication, to be concise and to articulate your thoughts clearly. When you're speaking, try to use a structure for how you respond to things. I like to put things in threes. And I've said this before. You can use the example of, first, second, third, if you want to give your listener or your audience something to grab onto. It just helps the listener to have that hook, that anchor. So they know how to follow you, which also then makes you look like you're in control of the conversation, you're in control of your thoughts, and you're able to articulate that well enough.
Yeah. I think this is super important. I mean, what you're talking about there is how to build the structure of a presentation, which is great. But I think also in just general conversation, we need to be mindful of how we're communicating just in a general conversation with our leaders, etc. So some people do have a tendency to tell the whole dang show, right? It's
Right.
getting to the point, and ain't nobody got time for that, right? So when you're talking to leaders, you need to be succinct in your communication. Remember, they're short on time and they don't need the entire backstory. So by learning how to do this, you're going to elevate your executive presence by showing some situational awareness. So that what I mean by
Right.
that is recognizing that their time is precious. So you need to get to the point. And this means that you need to give top line information and then 3 clear bullet points. So a suggested formula for this is what's the situation? Why are you telling them? And what the suggested solution is? right?
Mhm.
And then at the end, you either need to get like a buy-in or an agreement question or their opinion. So, are you on board with that, or what do you think? So you've given
Right.
information, you've told them why you're telling them specifically, you've given an option for a solution, and then you're asking for their agreement. Very, very simple.
And I would also use that formula even if you're drafting an email. The
Mm,
more you can get used to and practice that kind of communication, the easier it will be, and
yeah,
will also make the way you work with people a lot better, a lot more improvement in that area.
yeah, 100%.
Sure. Like, we also don't want our message to come across as word vomit. This is actually kind of landing off what you're talking about here is, so what I'll add here is the active listening. I think a lot of people listen to defend rather than listen to understand. And active listening requires that you're in the moment and holding on to every word of what the other person is saying rather than listening, because what happens is I think people are listening, they're hearing you, but they're already beginning to formulate that response in their mind. So
Yeah.
you actually are not hearing that person because you're so busy going, okay, I have to already prepare my response to what they're saying here. And because of that, so much gets missed. We're not actively listening to what that person is saying or what that message is. So take a moment once they're finished, let their message sink in with you before you start your response back to them. And even I've noticed when I have noticed few people who do that, who actually pause to reflect after someone has spoken, it also is very validating. Like if I was having a conversation with you and I'm all this that I'm sharing, if you are going to stop and pause, that to me is so validating because it shows me that you're really listening to what I say and you care about my message. So that also I think, helps, it helps the person that you're talking to feel seen and heard. And I think that's also part of how you carry yourself as an executive. People, it matters how you make people feel, not just
Yeah.
how you deal with them.
Yeah, and as part of active listening, you also need to ask clarifying questions so that
Mm,
A, they know you've been listening, and
right.
B, so that you completely understand what they have said and what the agreed next step is. Because nothing wastes more time in corporate than two people walking away from a conversation with totally different ideas of what was just agreed. So check for
Right.
understanding and get agreement. So
Right.
listen without wanting to answer, check for understanding, then get agreement.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll also throw in just a few things of mistakes that I've seen executives display when I think they're trying to have executive presence. And I've just noticed a few things that I know I've put into my toolbox as things that I don't want to repeat. The first thing I'll add here is overcompensating. So trying too hard. When you're trying too hard, it is obvious to other people that you're trying too hard. And I think you have to remember, and this goes back to what especially Rachel had pointed out earlier, is about knowing yourself and doing that inner reflection work. When you know yourself, you don't have to try too hard. You're gonna show up as you are. So it does require some work up front, but try to take the time to get to know yourself, and then you can avoid appearing to try too hard and trying to fake your confidence. It actually does the opposite and comes off as arrogant. I would also be really intentional about taking in feedback. If people are giving you feedback, try to really think about what their message is and take it for people who just want you to do well, to continue growing and to be better. So, you know, if you have a tendency, avoid the tendency to ignore the feedback because when you don't listen to that constructive criticism, it can actually hinder your growth. And I did say this earlier, but I'm going to emphasize it again. Avoid being inauthentic. So if you are taking cues from other people and trying to replicate things that they're doing, it may not translate to who you are. So really try to show up as who you are. That goes a long way. People can always tell when you're not being sincere with them. So really try to be who you are when you're in that executive presence mode for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to accept that mistakes are part of the journey and
Hmm.
use as data to find out what works and what doesn't so you can keep moving forward. Failure is not failure, it's just a first attempt in learning. And, we're
Right.
always going to make mistakes. Things are always going to happen. And it's the way I like to look at it is that it's just course correction. We're just simply finding out what works and what doesn't along the way. And so that
Exactly.
really just helps us to then move forward with, "Oh, that didn't work. Let's try something else."
Exactly. I like that. Just course correction,
Mm,
and part of the challenge that I had mentioned earlier was trying to have the executive presence while also being authentic. And I think it's important that we share how to be genuine in those high stakes moments. Now, I will admit I'm still working through this, but here's what I'd like to offer. So for me, to be authentic means sharing who I am, and I like to do that by sharing personal stories and using that to connect with my audience or to the other person through relatable experiences. So I do try to share stories about challenges that I've overcome that relate to a specific topic, which also I think shows them that I'm a real person and I've experienced things just like they have. It also, I think, is very validating for people.
mhm.
I also like to connect with people by speaking from the heart and letting my passion and sincerity shine through by talking about why a particular topic matters to me personally. And I think when you speak from the heart, it's just naturally how I speak anyway, but I find that it allows me to build better relationships with people and create that environment of trust and psychological safety. And I'll also say that I like to stay true to my values. I use my values to guide my actions with my core beliefs. So that means if honesty is a core value for me, which it is, being transparent in how I communicate is also part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of power in storytelling, and storytelling actually connects you with others because it makes you relatable. They can see
Mhm.
themselves in those examples as well. So gives that visual picture. And, as always, we're all about values, values, values. So figure out your professional and personal values to help you develop a strong personal brand. So know what you stand for and why, and use setbacks as springboards and share your journey because you're going to become a better leader when you do all of that.
Here, here. Well, we have spent a lot of time talking about executive presence and authenticity, and our hope is that you can take away these insights from this episode. Seek feedback. Get constructive feedback from a trusted colleague or a mentor or a peer. Ask them to observe how you present and come across and for them to give you some honest feedback. Sometimes when we have others who have that, third eye give us some feedback, it really opens up blind spots which we may not be aware of. So it's really important to be aware of those blind spots. Now, while executive presence is important, it's also important to carry your identity with you, which means to be true to who you are and don't ever leave that behind.
And presence is about how you show up outwardly and inwardly. It's not just what you
Mhm.
wear, say, or do, it's the energy you bring too. So work on your internal world as well, which is that mindset stuff we talked about before, because this is
Yep.
how you affect real and long lasting change in your life and career.
Amen to that. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Leading Ladies Who Lunch podcast. If we can leave you with a thought, how are you going to hold your executive presence while maintaining authenticity? If you like this episode, we would be so grateful if you can share it with your friends and tag us on social media at Leading Ladies Who Lunch. Your reviews of this podcast mean so much to us. We'd love it if you can rate it and subscribe to the show.
Remember, you can find us and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. So subscribe to stay up to date with the latest episodes and follow us on Instagram at Leading Ladies Who Lunch.
Stay tuned for another great episode in 2 weeks.
Until then, stay sassy.
Thank you for joining us on the empowering journey at the Leading Ladies Who Lunch podcast. We hope you've enjoyed our insightful discussions, actionable strategies, and inspiring stories that we break down during each episode. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to Leading Ladies Who Lunch on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And remember, the conversations you've heard on this podcast are just the beginning of your journey. Let your voice be heard, inspire change, and continue breaking barriers as you lead with authenticity, resilience, and unwavering determination.
Until next time, keep embracing your leadership potential, challenging the norms, and shaping a better world for women in the workplace. Leading Ladies Who Lunch, empowering women, changing lives.